Welcome to the MontCAS Test Security and Data Integrity video series. The purpose of this video is to provide the viewer with the principles of data integrity. This video will explore these 4 objectives so the viewer can complete this training with the following understandings. How does an analogy of the scientific process apply to the principles of data integrity? Why is data integrity important? How can testing conditions be controlled? What happens if conditions are not consistent? Data integrity means having the highest professional and ethical standards so that the results are trustworthy. To explore this concept further, let's start with this scientific process analogy. For the purposes of the analogy, we will abbreviate a few steps, but the basic approach to science is defining 1. A problem, 2. Observing, 3. Asking questions, 4. Testing out ideas, and 5. Drawing conclusions. This basic process is a useful analogy for our assessment purposes because it is what we do. Problem. We want to know how our students are doing in relation to our educational goals and grade level content expectations. This is the ultimate claim or reporting goal we wish to answer with our MontCAS summative assessments. For our MontCAS assessments, we have ensured they are valid by aligning the assessment to our content standards or the inferences we wish to make about students' knowledge, skills, and abilities through performance, such as a test score. Make observations. In order to support our claims, we need to make some observations. In this case, we need to collect some information from students or administer the MontCAS summative assessments to know how these kids are doing. For these observations to be valid, we need to make sure we use a consistent approach to data collection. Asking questions. From our observations, we ask questions to try to understand our observations better. We also create interventions or supports we believe to help address our concerns. Testing out ideas. We implement these interventions or supports to see how they assist students, such as reflected in student outcomes. Drawing conclusions. The last and most important element of this analogy is drawing meaningful conclusions based on these data. In order to draw conclusions, we must have confidence in the data so we can be assured these data actually mean what we think they mean. In this case, were our interventions and supports successful? If we can't rely on the data, then our interpretations are meaningless. Data integrity is important because it upholds the trustworthiness and validity of the evaluation tool. Without confidence in the data, we cannot use the continuous improvement process to identify ways to improve or evaluate change. We must deploy strong data governance and collection practices to ensure integrity in our student achievement data. How does PDIR work? Well, it's a dynamic process. The aim is on prevention and ways test administrators can employ ethical standardized practices for test administration. Similar to the continuous improvement cycle and the data governance process, PDIR is an iterative process. Reflection is central to ensure consistent improvement in quality. Since we know our assessments are valid, through alignment to our standards, the next piece is reliability. So how can data have quality? We can employ principles of data collection. The first principle of data collection is consistency. Test administrators' most critical task in test administration is to provide consistency in the school and classroom setting. Test administrators are the first and foremost as a data collector. Standardized data collection is important for ensuring replication and repeatability. If our goal is to compare students from one school to another, then we must assure data users the conditions they were assessed were similar to one another, thus establishing standard conditions from one school or classroom to the next. This process lends itself nicely to the second principle of data collection, which is the elimination of errors. If test administrators follow the same rules, there will be few to no errors, which errors, or in this case, testing incidences, that could ultimately interfere with the interpretation of the test scores. For more guidance on this, do's and don'ts, explore the MontCAS Ethical Testing Behavior Guidance resource using the Click Here link. How can testing conditions be controlled? Since it is not possible to create a controlled experiment in each classroom to measure the learning of students over the course of their educational experience, standardized summative assessment provide us with a means to estimate the knowledge, skills, and abilities these students have acquired over the course of the school year. To make sure we can compare these results, all test administrators are expected to complete annual training and review assessment-specific test administration manual, or TAM, like the Smarter Balanced Assessment pictured here. The TAM provides information for the test administrators on the procedural and policy guidance to prepare for and administer the assessment. The TAMs and the OPI published guidelines are the closest thing we can do to controlling conditions. Now that we understand the principles of collection, including consistent, standardized practices for test administration and reducing or eliminating errors, the final step is drawing appropriate conclusions from the system. Not following these steps ultimately jeopardizes the interpretations of the data. A more serious example for not upholding the ethical standards and data integrity for the case of the results would be making false claims or exaggerations about the data. This is another form of test fraud, as it is intentional and aimed to mislead. All conclusions about the data should be rooted in evidence or supported, meaning the interpretations are accurate and appropriate based on the data. The Montana Office of Public Instruction encourages summative assessments scores to be just one of multiple measures. Assessments provide critical information about student learning, but no single assessment should ever be the sole factor in making an educational decision about a student, an educator, or a school. We end this analogy just like the scientific process, testing, and alliterative process. The best way to avoid errors and misadministration is to follow the standardized expectations and guidelines to prevent and avoid issues before they arise. Now please take a moment to complete these H5P questions before we move on to the next topic.